So hello everybody and welcome to our first online QHRN seminar. So my name is Holly and I'll be chairing today. So just to start with a bit of housekeeping, if you can please keep your microphones muted and your videos off, and please do feel free to tweet about the seminar today. So please use the chat to ask questions and I will then read these out for our speaker to answer in the question and answer after the seminar. Just to let everybody know, we are recording the seminar, so it should be available on our website after the meeting today. And while you're here, I would just like to take this opportunity to advertise our QHRN conference, which will take place on the 18th and 19th of March 2021. And the abstract submission is now open, and the theme is on trust, so please do submit your abstract by the 31st of August. If you are new to the QHRN, welcome. You can find out more about us on the website on the screen or on our Twitter. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Rishita Nandagiri, who will be talking to us today about methodological considerations for qualitative abortion research. So thank you, Rishita.
Am I good to go?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. Thanks to the QHRN for having me and making this happen, even in the midst of this global pandemic that we're in. I hope you and your families are all keeping well as can be expected in these rather difficult time. And also thanks to QHRN for making this happen and for all of the hard work that went on to facilitate this. I'd like to go back to 3 years ago, to 2017, when we were in quite a different world. I had just come back to the UK after collecting data for my PhD in 2 rural districts in South India, where I'd been speaking and interviewing women about their abortion-related trajectories. I was at university. I was loitering outside my supervisor's office. My supervisor, Professor Ernestine Coast, and Dr. Titiana Leone. I was sort of meandering outside waiting for a meeting, and I wanted to discuss a half-formed idea about the methodology chapter, parts of which I want to discuss with you today. Before leaving for data collection, I'd agonized over my research design. How do you collect data on something that is so mired in secrecy? How do you recruit people? What implications does this then have for my sample, for my analysis? How do I manage the formal ethics requirements against some of the imperatives of feminist ethics? Are they in opposition? Because researching abortion is about the multiple ways in which power operates and being very present and attending to them. While other qualitative health research, such as work on HIV or STIs or sexualities, things that are stigmatized and deemed taboo, they all contend with similar issues, similar questions. But the nature of abortion stigma also has to contend with secrecy and shame and silence, all of which operate in very specific ways. Abortion research has to contend with the highly gendered aspects of abortion, its episodic nature, the legality of procedures, the advent of medical abortion, which is using oral pills to induce an abortion, all of which can allow concealment, which provides a lot of additional challenges for abortion research and abortion studies to grapple with. So in India, where abortion is legal and has been for a number of years, is available under a broad range of reasons, it remains stigmatized and can be difficult to access. It can be difficult to access because of the presence of strong norms around family, sexuality, womanhood, motherhood, the taboo around premarital sexual activity, of which abortion is then a marker, the lack of non-judgmental services that are available. At present, an estimated 73% of all abortions that take place in India are through medical abortion pills that are taken outside of formal health facilities. This is almost always without medical advice or supervision. Women also tend to turn to private facilities, and despite the high cost, because they value the higher levels of privacy or confidentiality and anonymity that it might afford them. So I devoured a lot of methodological work on abortion research before I went on fieldwork, but I found that it remained descriptive and minimal, and that's partly a function of journals and journal constraints, of course. And secrecy was implicit within their research design. It was subsumed as a function of efforts towards ensuring confidentiality and anonymity. And it didn't really answer my burning question of how do I account for secrecy? And so this half-formed idea that I was mulling over before my supervisory meeting was about confronting this ever-present tension, navigating secrecy and stigma to identify women who have terminated a pregnancy, while also maintaining and securing that secrecy. I was also challenged by the paradox presented by this need, that by maintaining and upholding secrecy, I was running the risk of reinforcing abortion stigma. I've been thinking about this for a while now, grappling with it in my research and how it poses complex questions about feminist research and ethics, how it links to our notions of agency and what it means to speak, what that means for how we conduct research. It's important for me to acknowledge that some of my comments here today have been shaped by a lot of conversations with my supervisors, with my friends and my colleagues, as I tried to think out loud to try and unpick and unpack these questions. And this presentation is part of that grappling and that personal journey. And I'd like to invite you to please join me in this thinking out loud and grappling and trying to make sense of these rather complex questions of what it means for how we do research. I really like drawing on Cynthia Enlow's idea of research as curiosity. Curiosity, the asking of questions in a bid to learn more and understand the shape and meaning and existence of things. It can shape how we imagine and how we reconstruct the world. For me, curiosity pushes us to ask questions of what we know, why it is this way, and how we came to know it. How can we even begin to understand it? So for me, Enlow, when referring specifically to women, points to key elements of what makes this a distinctively feminist approach to research. Who we take seriously, that we take women and their experiences seriously. But what she also points to is the invisibilized. And that when we visibilize them, when we visibilize narratives, we do so carefully. And we do it with attention, with thoughtfulness for what is being said, but also for what has been left unsaid. Feminist research and approaches demand that the unseen and the unacknowledged be made visible and heard. To voice is a feminist imperative, and that in the voicing we are challenging power and we're enabling empowerment. The act of speaking and voicing alone is empowerment and therefore become abortion, for example, challenges the stigma that surrounds it. It then normalizes abortion. It unearths it, this research, and it holds it up to the light. And what this then does, our form of research, is that it demonstrates this assumed liberatory potential of research. And this process and this relationship is often portrayed as linear, which I take issue with. Abortion is mired in silence and secrecy. And for example, all of the women in my sample who participated in my study all valued secrecy. And they went to great lengths, including potentially risking their own health and well-being in order to secure it. Some women managed to secure more secrecy than others. Those who voiced their intention to have an abortion met with resistance or had to endure much longer negotiations, while those who kept it to themselves, who thought about who they could speak with, who they could disclose to, their secretive attempts to source information and pills meant fewer people were involved in their trajectories, and far fewer barriers or delays were experienced. So in these cases, I was puzzled, or had to grapple with the realization that it was secrecy rather than voicing that enabled their agency. And to act and to exercise agency over their own bodies and their own lives. And I think it made clear to me that all research in some way is about secrets and silences of different kinds. And these silences and their quality matter. Women are silent for a number of different reasons. to be silent, keep silent, silence as protection, as dissent or resistance, silence and secrecy as safety, as forgetting. These silences and secrets demonstrate the limits of our knowledge, of what we can know, the partiality of our knowledge, and how we come to know it. So, where do secrets then reside in research processes? If all research is in some way about secrets and silences, whether we're trying to understand where they are or attempting to unearth it, or understanding how they shape and mediate our social worlds, then it resides at every level of the research process and is central at different points. It lives in the bones of our research. And I think it means considering how secrets and silence all shape and affect our theoretical frames, our interactions with institutional review boards, the ways in which it affects our data collection, and how we speak these secrets that we've collected, how we speak them into the world. My research diaries and some of my scribbled thoughts since 2017, in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to attempt to consider how it's shaped my work. I think it's also important for me to acknowledge here, like secrets, like empowerment, research is not linear. And while I've tried to structure it in this presentation, I will be speaking across the different elements as well. Theorizing how silence and secrecy manifest in research is to pay attention to how it functions as an interaction, as a dynamic social process. Stigma, shame, guilt, and secrecy are all interactional, they're all dynamic social processes, and they all shape women's abortion-related experiences. Abortion stigma is reproduced locally. It's a compound stigma. That is, it's building on other forms of discrimination and structural injustices, all of which can create silences. Shame and guilt, which can be manifestations of internalized abortion stigma, can result in secrecy. Secrecy and disclosure are often represented as like polarized phenomena and as though they're mutually exclusive, which I think is quite an inaccurate and unhelpful binary. If we hold that secrecy is partial, that it is relative and is embedded in and interpreted through cultural context, through cultural meanings and practices, then like stigma and shame, secrecy is a social phenomenon. It is constructed, negotiated, and maintained. So in my study, some women confided in their mothers or their sisters about their pregnancy and their intention to terminate. These disclosures were tempered with their social and emotional bonds that allowed them to access abortion care without divulging it to their husbands or their parents-in-law. Women would travel to their natal villages where there was a code of silence. I'm visiting my mother, or it's been so long since I've seen my sister. And they would collectively maintain silence in order to protect and to empower, once again allowing and paving women's access to abortion under this shroud of secrecy and silence. I think it's also important for us to think about what we mean by secrecy and that there's many types, right? These notions of open secrets, where things are left unnamed or untalked about, but are known anyway. It means a social desire to conceal and to look away. I asked my respondents how they knew who to approach for abortion information, for abortion pills, and they invariably laughed. They would laugh and say, everyone knows, or, you hear this and then you forget, but when you need it, you know. It's just something that is known. And I think it shows us how abortion, even though it is so taboo, it is so stigmatized and so tied to shame, it is ever present. It's ever present in these open secrets, in what isn't said directly, but is always referred to obliquely. Which ties in with this notion that secrecy is contextual. Illegality or the criminalization of abortion, for example, can make secrecy an imperative. It can enable underground networks, as it has around the world, where people are sworn to secrecy to try and provide access to care. A whisper network that once again relies on social bonds, where secrecy bonds us together and forms resistance. Understanding that secrecy and silence can be forms of resistance in where it is legal as well, like in India, I think is another way for us to grapple with the complexity of secrecy. And it also highlights the ways in which we think about agency and we think about voicing. So for example, once again in my study, women would describe remaining silent in clinics when they're meeting with a doctor or a healthcare provider who would ask them, confirm their pregnancy and then say, does your husband know? Or are you happy? Aren't you happy? Why aren't you happy? Or women would describe holding their silence when their mothers-in-law would ask about their missing period. Oh, aren't you late? Where is it? Is something wrong with you? Are you sick? And I think in this silence and holding silence, they're resisting. They're resisting not just being forced to reveal either their pregnancy to their husbands or to their mothers-in-law, or even in the want to disclose to. But what it also resists are the associated norms of womanhood and motherhood that are then placed upon them. And here, I think their silence in refusing to engage with this, their silence actually speaks words. And I think this is really relevant for research designers. It's crucial to contend with the nature of secrecy and disclosure itself, that these are social, negotiated, intentional. And it offers us insights for design, not just in terms of women keeping silent or when they keep silent, when they choose to reveal, what they reveal, to what extent, what they choose to obfuscate, with whom they choose to do this, but also for how providers and other actors in the abortion access and provision ecology act, and how they function, how they work with secrets and silence. And I think understanding secrecy is epistemologically relevant because there is no single objective truth for us to uncover. It is always what individuals choose to reveal to us. And all of this obviously affects our analysis, because then the secrets that are revealed can only be understood in the context that they're revealed in. I think secrets and silences are not empty. They tell us what cannot be said and how we communicate around it nonetheless. Theorizing secrecy in abortion pushes us to question how else we can understand voice in abortion studies, especially when speaking can jeopardize a very fragile social contract. How can we understand voice when it cannot always be spoken, but can sometimes be observed in action? I'd like to reflect quickly on ethics as well and how it ties in with abortion and doing research, and again the imperative to voice. So I applied for ethics clearance through the LSE as well as through an IRB in India. Both institutional review boards remarked on the sensitive nature of my research. And I recognize that abortion is broadly considered a socially sensitive research topic. And that's because of the stigma and the taboos surrounding it. But as Lee and Renzetti argue, sometimes sensitive is used as a synonym for controversial. By designating it as this sensitive topic, I worried that it would re-stigmatize abortion. And instead of treating it like a common procedure that many people experience over the course of their reproductive lives, by locating it as sensitive, it is automatically framed as a traumatic process, as something that will cause pain. And I don't reject this entirely out of hand. I think being responsible with research requires that we ensure to endeavour to minimise harm, that we provide support and resources, that we minimise impact. But this framing, it also suggests that speaking about abortion is automatically equated with pain, which I don't think is true, or not always true. Speaking about abortion and about abortion experiences, and coming back to that feminist imperative to speak, can be an act of revelation, of long-kept secret. It can be relief, it can be triumph, it can be recognizing that long path and the end of it. And I think rather than identifying the topic as sensitive, I think it's important that we recognize the potential costs, social, material, emotional, and psychic of participation, but also of what it can offer. It can offer space, reflection, relief, catharsis. Understanding these, I see ethical abortion research as taking a thoughtful, sensitive, careful, and deliberate approach to ensuring participants' confidentiality and safety, and their secrecy. This recasting of abortion research as deliberate, as dealing with secrets, moves us further away from the notion of ethics as checkboxes, but towards a more situated and dynamic understanding. One of the IRBs that I had applied to, and the other one actually disagreed, suggested that I think about mechanisms in my research to report illegal activity. And when we talk about illegal activity around abortion, that gets very mired. So when women and the community health workers that I was interviewing would very matter-of-factly discuss sex selection, abortion in India, an open secret, or self-managing their abortions, both of which are illegal. It's not something that I could report, because in some sense, these were confidences that were given. They were private, intimate, and tied, once again, to the social norms and forces that surround them. To report would be to betray these confidences. And I found that in seeing myself as a secret keeper here, as a secret keeper, I was confronted with the ethics of my research and where I draw the line, and how this may be at odds with how the IRB frames it. And this is something I'll come back to when I'm discussing reflexivity, particularly on how this then ties to notions of anonymity. So in order to navigate these silences and secrets, I think a lot of, as qualitative researchers, we tend to engage in trust building. We talk a lot about building trust with our respondents, which is obviously a key component of qualitative research, but it's also an aspect in the negotiation of the self and the performance of the researcher self. And while traditionally the researcher's role can be seen as, affective, is it sympathetic or not, as cognitive, are you taking on the naive role or the informed role of different configurations of the same, all in an effort to build trust, build rapport with our respondents. Durkheim and others argue that trust is a necessary precondition to all agreements, and it structures our social realities, where trust is the silent partner. It's the conscious collective in relations among people. Cook, who builds on Lewis and Weigart's dimensions of trust, which are cognitive, emotional, and behavioral, suggests that while these notions, the cognitive, emotional, and the behavioral, are all analytically separable, they tend to merge into the experience of how we understand trust in reality. I think trust is established when individuals don't need any more evidence or rational reason for why they trust each other. The emotional and the affective dimension is this emotional bond between people. And if we see then the behavioral as taking on a risky course of action, revealing a secret, for example, believing then that everybody involved who has heard your secret is going to behave in a responsible way, behave dutifully towards safeguarding your secret. And I think if we think about these two notions in relation to our research and how we shape it, how it will affect our interactions and our behaviors as researchers, as instruments, I think it reveals, and not just about our interview process, but also about ourselves. I think another thing to really keep note of when we're talking about trust is that trust is time-bound, and it affects the research encounter, and requires the building of a space where trust can actually function, where it can flourish. So that it's only when this happens that silence can be broken and that secrets can be spoken. And I think that building trust is affective, and it can be deliberate. How do we signal trustworthiness, for example? How do we build it into our designs? I'm not sure that I know the answer to this, but I was reflecting on a few of my research points to think about what helped. So I think first in recruitment particularly, the secrecy and the silence that surrounds abortion will obviously shape recruitment strategies and accounting for that, and it will affect our sampling criteria, shaping who can participate and who doesn't. And one of the things I based recruitment, because what it would do is that it would always capture people who self-manage their abortions, but also accounting for how facilities themselves can be sites of distrust, which can be tied to women's previous negative experiences or fears that through this facility their abortion will become public. I used a bit of a hybrid mechanism in my study, and I won't go into it too much right now because I think it'll distract us, where I worked with a cadre of lay community health workers. In India, we have, at the village level, each village has an accredited social health activist, women from the village who are trained for about 20 days and are the frontline workers of the health system. They're not trained medical professionals, but women from the village who, talk about access to contraception, family planning, vaccinations, accompany women to birth centres. So very much a part of village life. So I worked with a cadre of lay community with ASHAs, the lay community health workers, and I used an existing registry. So one of the things working with ASHAs did was that I was building on women's existing relationships with them. I was deliberately drawing on and recognizing the role of trust here and how its interactional nature. Women was willing to speak with me because they trusted the health workers who vouched for me. In discussing and they would look in the direction that the ASHA worker might be or had just left the room in. And they would often say, she trusts you, so I trust you. So variations of that. So once again, drawing on those social bonds that exist. And lay community health workers as well, when I'd be discussing abortion with them, would talk about and confide in me about about their roles in providing medical abortion access outside of legal or authorized abortion guidelines. And they were willing to take on this risky course of action and speaking with me, believing that I would treat this ethically and dutifully. And I don't think this is a personality quirk of mine. I don't think it's because of me. I think this trustworthiness is related to the university that I was affiliated with in India, where in some ways my location as outsider, as foreign, as separate, also played a role. While at the same time as locating me as someone who's Indian, who speaks the language, who understands, who is still one of our own, even if you are an outsider. This isn't to say that the gatekeepers were, always disclosing everything to me, or were always willing to link me with those who met my inclusion criteria. They sometimes refused. It did not matter if they caused me or the university offense. They would often say, I promised I would not say, I promised I would not reveal this, so I will not connect you with someone who meets your inclusion criteria. I can tell you that they exist, but this is all I'm willing to say. And I think that was once again a moment for me to think about the ways in which we speak about abortion, in what we share, in whose confidences we divulge. I think the site of our interviews also really mattered. I think in building spaces to speak and share, in my RB as well, and in most of the literature, qualitative researchers are often told to use private locations, where privacy automatically connotes safe or secure. It guarantees anonymity and confidentiality. And I'm sure most of the qualitative researchers here would agree, finding and securing that magical location is very, very difficult. It's difficult given the pressures of time and limited resources, as well as constraints of space and geography as well. And I think where you recruit has implications for the interview location. Coming back to my thought around facility-based recruitment, for example, it would mean perhaps that my interviews were conducted in the clinic or the hospital. And I think in this push for a private space, what happens if that's not possible? If it's not possible in the limited constraints of the primary health centre, we don't have enough rooms in the first place to conduct an interview there. I would be taking resources away from much needed services that ought to be provided. Or what if the respondent isn't comfortable there, if that isn't what they prefer? In a lot of my interviews, women wanted to be interviewed in the comfort of their own homes. They were rarely alone or uninterrupted. Children, sisters, parents at different moments who were entering and exiting the space. Women suggested, though, that this is where they felt safe, that they could create private spaces in the public, marking for me how notions of private differ and are once again affected by considerations of class and caste. Elwood and Martin suggest that sites or locations are imbibed with power and power relations, with memories, with emotional weight, all of which affect the dynamics of the space. Think then that if our locations are set in facilities only, if women are distracted or providers feel at risk, worrying about who can overhear them, I think it behooves us to rethink how and what locations we think about as safe, as spaces where you can speak. And I think in India, where caste plays out in such a powerful way, I also had to consider discomfort in very casted locations, such as clinics or supposedly neutral areas like in NGO offices. I'd like to read an excerpt from my research diary. Quote, "I asked if she wanted to sit in another room or go outside. She glanced at her mother-in-law by the stove, shaking her head quickly. She whispered, smiling slightly, 'If we go somewhere else, she will ask what I have to hide from her.' In plain sight, she holds on to her secret. I wonder where it is that we can tell secrets. Is the familiar where we actually keep and hold on to our secrets?" End quote. I think the centering of respondents as agency here extends to setting the location or voicing where they are comfortable speaking. It reinforces our understanding of consent and allows them to set the conditions of our conversation and where they're willing to indulge in this risky behavior in extending that trust to you. I'd also like to touch very quickly on the thinking about secrecy in conducting interviews. I think collecting good data means asking, the right questions, but it also requires listening and listening intently. A colleague of mine, Dr. Meena Guha, that the practices of listening are actually implicated in grids of power and knowledge, and that must be accounted for as well. Les Back talks about sociological listening as the movement between the boundaries of the personal and the public. I think that this means listening out for not just what is said, but as Sarah Ahmed points out, what remains unsaid because it cannot be spoken. Voicing spousal abuse, for example, or discrimination, something that many of my respondents danced around, needs to be something that is listened for. Back also talks about listening as seeing. And these observations about how our bodies reveal secrets, discomfort, how they infuse silence with sound, is essential to that close paying attention, to feeling around for what has been left unsaid. And I think this ties in very much with how we analyze our data as well. Taking notes on those observations and how our bodies reacted and the silences that were present, I think is essential for how we analyze, how we think about silence in research, and how we listen out for them as we transcribe our interviews. I think it comes back to those theoretical frames of where silence resides, how it shapes responses, and my own questioning. How much space do I leave for silence? How much space do I leave in my interviews for reflection, for a moment of discomfort to actually flourish, so we can grapple with it? And I think it pushes us to analyze then what cannot be uttered. That pause before explaining how a doctor spoke to them, their own non-response, how they remain silent around a question that I pose. How is this then viewed in our transcripts? How do we analyze the silence? What is our code for that? And in writing this, this or pulling this presentation together, I was really struck by how much silence and secrecy pervades my data. It isn't just in the obvious moments of, I haven't told anyone, so you don't tell them either, Akka. But in the comments and how they explained their absence in coming to speak with me in my interview. I told him, my husband, that I was going to see my sister, and you are like my sister also. And how in these secrets, in the silencing and what remains unsaid, these secrets are bonds. Lastly, I'd like to think about what it means to share these secrets. In talking a lot about my data and in sharing some of the secrets that are present in there, I've been struck by what it is that is possible for me to share. How do I locate this? How do I locate this sharing so it isn't mired in a colonial gaze of saving brown women, not just from brown men, but from themselves? In worrying about whether this can be misused, that this sharing, this narrative, this making visible can be misused by those opposed to abortion, by those who represent it and represent the women and their narratives and their experiences in a way that isn't true to them. And in worrying about how it can be misused, I have to think about which secrets it is that I can speak, what is possible to say. And in this, I have to reflect on my own positionality and my own gaze. I mentioned earlier that I was both insider and outsider. I was trading on those emotional bonds of being Indian, my ability to speak the language, but I was marked by my caste, my class, my foreignness. I didn't wear a bindi, my hair is too long, I didn't have any markers of marriage. I was transgressing in many ways. Yet they would call me Akka. Akka is big sister. And in this, they would gift me the responsibility of their narratives, their voices. In a lot of our RRB processes, we're required to guarantee anonymity. I had to keep their names secret, even when they told me that they want to be named. They want to be associated with their narratives, with their stories, with their experiences. How do we voice and at the same time hide? Is it essential to do so? In this case, I think it probably is, because I worry about how much detail I can share, how much can be traced back to them. I gave them names that mean power, strength, unbowed. And it is one way in which I could try to reclaim some of their own voice while removing their names. And I worried that in trying to showcase their voices, all I have done is actually obscure them, because I've read it through my own. I've spoken for them. I've spoken over them. And I think in all of this, there is another secret and another silencing. And all I can think of when I'm trying to share these secrets, or when I am analyzing, or when I'm analyzing them, and all I can think about how to guard against this speaking over, speaking for, is to try and be deliberate, to try and sit with this discomfort and find where it is that I can hold voice, where I can amplify rather than suffocate or silence. I think through all this, what I'd like to reflect on is how important it is to be more deliberate in our research encounters to ensure that we can gather evidence, that we can have data. And to what is hard to reveal. Gayatri Spivak suggests that ethics involves secrets, that is, it involves, or even that it must involve, recognizing the limits of what one can receive from others, the limits, in other words, of knowledge. As she describes, quote, "There's always a sense that something has not got across." In relation to the data, its construction and its analyses, the nature of secrecy means that we only have a partial understanding of realities, and our identities and subjectivities frame our interactions. I don't claim objectivity or have any pretensions to it, and my aim is not to neutralize my multiple identities and subjectivities. It is an inherent part of how I've come to collect, frame, and know the data, and be gifted these secrets. My data are partial. I only saw and experienced and perceived what I was allowed to see. And this is time and context bound, refracted through my own interpretations and exposing my own limits in knowing and representing. This is what Wanda Pillow calls a reflexivity of discomfort, seeking to know what at the same time situates this knowing as tenuous. And to me, all of this and the secret telling and unearthing is not in keeping with all of our IRB requirements, is of what can't be said, of what can't be known. I think what it is just tugging at the threads of how we construct knowledge and what underlies it. And I think what that does is that it involves creating space. It creates space for holding discomfort, for listening, and for being explicit for how all of this drives our data collection. I think it means that the roles that we play in it and the ways in which we shape our data, and not just our analyses, as a documenter, a note taker, must all be visible. Sarah Ahmed suggests that we should reclaim the idea of a feminist researcher as secretary. The secretary in the late Middle English means someone who is entrusted with secrets, a secret keeper. And for me, that's also knowing when and how we disclose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rishita. That was a really fascinating presentation, and I'm sure everybody watching also agrees. So we've got one question, which I'll read to you in a second, but just to remind everyone, please do add the questions into the chat box, because we're going to be going through those now. So the question is from Nicola Rishita, and it's, where does the requirement for secrecy in this research leave you in terms of dissemination? What are your aims for dissemination of your research, and who are your audiences and why?
Hello?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yep.
So the question is, where does the requirement of secrecy in this research leave you in terms of dissemination? What are your aims for dissemination of your research, and who are your audiences and why?
Thanks. I think that's a really great question. I think for me, in terms of my dissemination, there are different audiences. And I do want to disseminate my research because I think it goes back to that feminist imperative to speak. I think there's a lot of misinformation around abortion. I think there's a lot of ideas and notions, particularly about women who self-manage and the ways in which they do that and which women self-manage. And I think there is a responsibility to challenge it. Dr. Tiziana Leone also talks about our responsibility to data. I have collected this and I have a responsibility to disseminate that, for us to think about this further. So in terms of my audiences, I am planning on, there's the research community, of course, there's abortion researchers, abortion policymakers and advocates as another set of audiences, as well as, for me personally, it's really important to go back. I was meant to go back and disseminate some of these findings, not in its traditional research form, but in thinking about what this means for where the gaps lie for, say, women's understandings of the laws, of their own negotiations, as well as work particularly with community health workers and the ASHA workers in particular around their interactions with women, and think about this in a more practical sense and how this evidence can influence that. So what it has also done is it's made me think very carefully about what I can share and in which spaces I need to interact and visit. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Rishita. So another question is from Anne, and this one is, can you speak to secrecy regarding abortion versus secrecy around the unprotected sex, the sexual partner, the unintended pregnancy? Do you think that the secrecy women may feel around these different pieces can be separated?
I think that's a really insightful question. I think, I'll start with the second question first. I think the secrecy that women feel I think it has different flavors, definitely, because I think that's also mediated through women's specific social locations. So I think the secrecy, which is very much, say, tied to fear, to shame, and varying degrees of that. So, for example, if you're not married, I think the shame and the secrecy that surrounds, say, unprotected sex or your sexual encounter itself would be different. I think you're more, and I think the sort of quality of that would manifest differently. To say, if you are married, the secrecy may revolve more around wanting an abortion and keeping your pregnancy itself secret. And I think that difference is actually something to explore further. And so, yeah, so I can just sort of look at the question quickly. So I think women's social locations will mediate the shape or the quality of that secrecy and the way it manifests. Also how willing they are to discuss those specific experiences and how they will mediate where their trajectories to care, or what forms of care that they are seeking, and who they will disclose to. So particularly around, say, premarital sexual activity and then necessitating an abortion, you may turn to more strangers potentially than within your own family, all in a bid to keep those notions of honor and shame at bay. I would suspect. Even just in my own data, I think I see differences in how, so like older women were more willing to talk about abortion with strangers rather than discuss their pregnancy with people in their own social circle, often as a reflection of the shame and the fear of being shamed for their sexuality, where their pregnancy is a marker of their sexuality. So I think there are gradations.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Ben, and he has asked, I wondered how silence is read by healthcare professionals, e.g. an admission of guilt or keepers of secrets. Did women ever feel betrayed?
Absolutely. I think this is the thing also about silence, right? It can be read in so many ways. I think for a lot of healthcare professionals, silence was an admission of guilt, or an admission that you were doing something wrong. So, why are you pregnant? How did you get pregnant? Don't you know any better? Why have you not, why aren't you on an IUD? I've told you so many times, why aren't you on an IUD? And so when a lot of health workers, because I also interviewed health workers, would discuss silence, they would say, well, they're ashamed. That's why they're keeping silent. They know that there's nothing they can say to defend this. And that's not to say that some health workers weren't more empathetic to think, well, how can they say something? Their husband is there or their mother-in-law is there and they don't really have a voice. So they can't even refute. So I think, again, very much contextual and located in what, so whether it was seeking an abortion or whether it was confirming their pregnancy, and if that pregnancy itself was seen as, was problematized. So you've had too many children, or you're not married, or, you're too young, or other notions around which pregnancies are valued and which aren't.
Thank you. And we've got quite a few more questions, so we're going to get through as many of these as we can. So Georgia has said that she's really struck by your insight on how our language about sensitive topics can reinforce stigma or assumed pain. Did your language change with participants throughout the project?
Yes, absolutely. I think it was also slightly difficult for me because I wasn't doing interviews in English. So I think it was a learning curve around how, say, a more formal understanding of a word or of language differs, and how it shifts with context. I had an incredible research assistant who could always pull me up on this and say, well, maybe you need to rethink how you're phrasing this. So that did definitely shift. I think specifically in English, I became really careful and paid a lot of attention to how agency was being represented through my work. I think in a situation like, well, they stayed silent, I wouldn't want it to be read as, tacit acceptance of something, which could be read onto that behavior. And I think even just saying they decided to stay silent, or in how I reflected that, became quite important to me.
Perfect. So the next question is, I do research in a hospital setting and feel like secrecy is a big part of some of the meetings I observe. You spoke of observing body language or listening between the lines about what may or may not have been said. Do you have any tips for how to observe or notice secrecy when people do not immediately define it as secrecy themselves?
I think I didn't go into these interviews looking for secrecy, right? That wasn't what I was focusing on. It's now that I've taken a step back that I can look at my notes and go back to the transcripts and see what isn't said, and look for the silences and the absences. But what I did do is, as I was interviewing, I was always making a notes of, did they look away? Did they, how did they respond to the question? At the time, I was thinking about my own interview guide and whether that was working. What was it, the language? Was it something that is actually what I was focusing on? And I think over time, is sort of thinking about this as a way in which people were responding to my questions, but also to me and what it could reveal, not just about my interview guide, but about what isn't being said. That was one. I think the second thing is really paying, and I think to some extent we do this as qualitative researchers, is paying attention to how people are reacting to you. And I would make notes of it, and I usually have like a timestamp. So afterwards, being able to think about, okay, what else was happening at the time? Was their mother-in-law coming in and out? Was also helpful for me to sort of reflect, because I think it's important to think about our interviews not just as the words, but in the context of what else was occurring at the time.
So the next question is, can you reflect on the performance of trust as a researcher? You want people to do your research, you want them to trust you to take part, no matter how genuine your interest, you have a personal investment in gaining the participants' trust.
Yep, absolutely. I think trust as like a deliberate act of, like I say, that I'm not, how do I position myself as trustworthy? That isn't to say that women it's in this sort of what people share with you. And I think in this space, I'm also trusting that what they decided to share. There have been moments definitely where my respondents have obfuscated. So one of the respondents that as part of my study, I had actually had medical records that they did have an abortion, but in her narrative, she did not have an abortion. That is not something that she had. It was an accident, something happened, it was another operation. And that, to some extent, yes, it may be an unwillingness to disclose, but it may be also about how the lack of that social bond. And I think in this, with trust, I think it is really, at least for me, it was really being led by my respondents, and whether at what point, how much they're willing to engage, how much were they willing to talk, creating the space as much as possible for them to be comfortable. And at some points I felt very uncomfortable, and I think sort of ties back to that first question around, how you're going to disseminate this research, is about what was the point of this? What was the point of me discussing this with them? And understanding and hearing their narratives, if there wasn't going to be something that came after that wasn't just my research article, but had an impact. And I think the second thing here is that with just women revealing secrets to me, right? They would ask me questions, often uncomfortable questions, in which I would reveal myself to them. They would ask about my life, where I was living, was I not married, why wasn't I married, did my parents not object? And in this, I think it comes back to this notion of how trust is interactional, how that secret sharing is interactional. And in many ways, I was very open with them and would answer their questions as honestly as possible. And I will say that that wasn't always true with, say, the healthcare providers that I was interviewing, that I wasn't as open with them, that I would shield a lot more as a researcher with them than I would with the women I was interviewing.
Thank you. So the next question is, are you intending in the future to look at secrecy around miscarriage and multiple miscarriage as well?
Not yet. I think there is definitely a link between abortion and miscarriage. So even in the language that we use, in the vernacular language, it's sort of like it dropped. So in some ways there is obfuscation there around what can be named and what can't be named. Obviously there's a lot of silence and a lot of secrecy around miscarriage as well. I am broadly interested in women's reproduction. Oh, maybe someday, but I think there's a lot, I think, around secrecy and miscarriage and multiple miscarriages there.
Thank you. So we are at 12 o'clock now, so if you do have to leave, please do feel free. But if it's okay, Rishita, we've got 2 more questions. Mm-hmm. Is that okay to take?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So Nicola, before we do that, has mentioned that it would be great if you could make any publications about this available to participants. So if that's okay, we can share it on the QHRN page or Twitter, or things like that. Yeah. So Julia has asked, how do you navigate white Western people's views of your work?
I think that's a great question. I don't, I guess. I can only present my work located in the frames that I use, in that it is located in the lives and narratives of brown women, of Indian women. And again, it's something I tend to mention, and I'm sorry it's taking me so long to say it, but also specifically women, because everyone in my sample identified as women. That is obviously not to say that trans and non-binary folks don't have abortions in India, they do. I think it's the reading of and the gaze that people can put on this. And I think in my work, I try to guard against that gaze by locating it within a global South-centric narrative. I think this is also true for how, say, people might read my work on abortion itself and actually see it as, or utilize it in ways that go against my belief that abortion is something that all women have right to and should be given access to. So all I can do against it is situate it, which any other readings of the work that might put upon a gaze of, say, saving, of the disempowered women in the global South could potentially be challenged by in how it is actually written, or that's at least what I hope my work sets out to do and does.
Thank you. And the final question, and I'm going to paraphrase this because it's quite a long one. I'm curious about whether you can say more about how women learn about abortion. Did you find evidence of sharing experiences around abortion within families or friend groups, or ways that people might talk about abortion without referencing it as abortion, but rather menstrual regulation or pregnancy loss, for example?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things I talk about or look at is, how did you learn about abortion? Like, how did you know it was an option? And women, like I said, it is very present. A distant cousin, my neighbor, my sister, my mother told me when I said I didn't want this, or when she saw that when I think as particularly women talk about it, and I think that's one element. I think the other element is, I know of a story. I heard about this woman, and she didn't want it, so this happened. Usually those stories end tragically. I've tried to find out if those, if there's any truth in those stories, if that did actually happen to a woman. And it's interesting that it didn't matter which village I was in, that even in like different districts, that same permutation of the story existed. I think the second or like the third thing there is sex selection is very present. It is something talked about that's quite matter of fact. And so even with that, sort of there is a relation that this is something that is possible. I may not do it for sex selective reasons, but it is possible to do as a procedure. There is the other issue there that because everyone's very aware that sex selection is illegal or is criminalized and penalized, but that somehow sort of extends to abortion, but not feeling like, okay, if I did it, what are they going to do? No one's ever going to find out because it'll be kept a secret. Also, they don't actually ever say that anyone's ever been criminalized for sex selection itself, but they know it is illegal. So I think understandings of abortion and the possibility of abortion. So when you begin seeking an abortion, then you begin either with your family, or if you're trying to keep it separate from your family or keep that secret, then women began to ask, say, a trusted ASHA worker who might say, oh, I don't want to talk about these, you need to go somewhere else, or would ask a pharmacist, or their husbands or their other family members would approach pharmacists. So as there's ways in which they try to understand and figure out what information they need. In terms of other words for abortion, they didn't use menstrual regulation, but they did use a version of pregnancy loss. So they would say gira hai, so it's dropped, or safai kiya hai, so like cleaned, I've had it cleaned. So versions of that would exist. Yeah, they rarely use the official word for abortion. So it would be didn't want, nikal diya, so removed it, and words like that. So, but, and even in sort of narrating those stories, they would use similar frames and not say garbhapat, which is abortion.
Thank you so much, and a huge thank you from everybody for such a fantastic seminar, Rishita. It's been really interesting and really insightful for everybody. By the look of the chat, everybody's got really positive comments, so I hope you can read through those. So thank you everybody for attending, and as I've mentioned, we are recording, so hopefully all going well with technical issues. We should be able to upload this to our website, and thank you all, and we hope to see you at our next seminar.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody. Thank you for all the great questions, and once again, thanks everyone for organising this. It was great to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Rishita. I'm just going to figure out how to stop the recording.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks very much. Oh, should I wait then?
No, it should be okay because I should be able to do it.